it's this idea that it's a pestilence on society, which I find ironic because now he's completely, again, I've talked about this before, he's completely gone back because now he's living in, basically in England where there's been a theological vacuum that Islam has come in and filled, and then he actually sees what a negative theology, living in a negative theology can be like, right? So, again, this is just him using rhetoric to try to sound, I've lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I've been on a landfill for 3 days, so I'm a little fried. So if I'm really kind of scatterbrained today, I am sorry. I'm trying my best. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the next point because I can't speak apparently. So, is God a misogynist, right? This is I would say there's two answers. It's both yes and no, right? If you take the modern day term of misogyny, then yes, because God doesn't support things like abortion, right? Pretty obviously. But if you take the actual definition of it, then no. God, if you take what I find very interesting is if you look throughout history, and then you look at the Bible, you would find that God is drawing people into this kind of, because back in the day, women were kind of second-class citizens. They weren't, or even sometimes not even citizens at all. They were kind of just existed to, continue the human race. But they didn't have rights or stuff like that. Where God is very clear throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament that, women are equal with men and that they have the same rights and privileges as that. You have the whole both are created in the image of God. You have, I find even really interesting is the first people to encounter Christ risen were women, right? Culturally speaking, and even in the Jewish culture, that was really kind of a negative thing. Women's testimonies were not supposed to be, or weren't trusted as much as a man's. But what it's showing there is, I think also you see that you have this kind of thing, this equality there. And then further on, you have, men are supposed to, love their wives. And as Mike likes to put out, it says it's 4 times there, love your wife, love your wife, love your wife, telling it, really drilling that in there. And there's also the verses about being equal in Christ, right? So no, God is not a misogynist in the definitional term, but in kind of the modern zeitgeist where, misogyny is anyone who disagrees with abortion or other stuff like that. That is kind of a silly, pointless thing. It's also same thing. He uses the same thing with homophobic, which is kind of like a zeitgeist term where if you don't agree with homophobia or the homosexual agenda, then you're homophobic. When in reality, Christ is calling them out of their sins, right? Yes, the Bible is clear that homosexuality is a sin, but Christ loves these people because he's calling them out of that sin to come have communion with Christ, right? Which is the most loving thing that anyone can do. So, good? You got a question, Luke?
Many people would consider that not loving.
Just because people don't consider it loving doesn't mean it's not loving, right? I mean, if I'm stabbing myself 3 times a day and you tell me, hey man, that's not good, that would be a very loving thing, even if I say, no man, this is what I want to do, right? I am willfully harming myself in a way that I like to do. That's what it is. They are willfully harming themselves in a way they enjoy. And you're telling them you should stop harming yourself. You should stop basically killing yourself. That is the loving action to take. So just because people don't think it's loving doesn't mean it's not, right? So that's just because it's, that type, yes.
So they need to prove that it will hurt them in the long run.
Well, I don't know if you necessarily need to prove it. I mean, that's just a fact of reality. I mean, it's will lead to eternal separation with God, right? That's the worst thing that could happen to you possibly, right? So, yeah, but I don't think you need to go down the route of if you follow the homosexual lifestyle, you're probably going to die when you're like 60, if not younger. So, but that's kind of a different way about it. But, so we are moving on, and this is, come on, there we go. Okay, is God sadomasochistic? That is a fun word to say. Basically, this is the idea that God likes violence, and that, masochism is basically the love of violence. And so basically what he's implying there is that God loves to torture the people or kill the people. And I find that really interesting because God is constantly putting mercy on these people that are terrible people, right? I think that's the thing we have to recognize, is that there is often a lot of really bad people in the Old Testament that are doing horrible things. Like, you take the Phoenicians, right? Or the Canaanites, and they were like, they sacrificed children on a daily, regular basis, right? And then God talks about how he sends in, the Israelites and he says, I want you to wipe these people out because they're, are such horrible groups of people. But like people see that, it's like, oh, God's, loving the violence. It's like, no, God is judging people for their actions and their sins. So, do you have a...
Yeah, it's interesting to me that that was so well known in the Old Testament times that Jonah happened.
Oh, yeah.
That Jonah was like, I don't want to do this because I know this is what you're going to do.
Oh, yeah.
And sure enough, that's what he did. It just made Jonah mad.
Yeah, you are right that God shows mercy to people, and it was so well known to those people that, yeah, Jonah didn't want to do it because he knew that God would show mercy to these people if they repented of their sins. And of course they did. And so God showed mercy on them. So you have many instances in the Bible where God shows mercies upon these people. But then once they've reached basically their sin is so great that he judges them, just because God calls this judgment upon them doesn't mean that he's this sadomasochistic type of person. Yeah, this next one, okay, why are you not going? Okay, now it appears. Okay, I don't know why. Apparently I just got to hit it like 3 or 4 times. So this one is kind of this, filiacide is basically the killing of your family. This is kind of the idea that if you read the Old Testament, there's many times where their death penalty is ascribed to, say, like, you don't honor your parents, right? Then, this kid should be put to death, right? And a lot of people don't understand that, one, God's trying to basically, get the people of Israel to be a holy people, right? Try to purge all the sins from their life. But also, they like to imagine that, it's this verse where it talks about, the one they always point to is where you have this parents and this child is sinning against them. They're not honoring them. So they go to the judges, and the judges are like, okay, you got to fix yourself. And then they reject that. And so then the punishment for basically rejecting the counsel of the judges is that this child should be stoned. And everyone likes to think, oh, this is like a little toddler, right? They hear this and they're like, oh, he's killing children. And it's like, no, in the sense of that, when you look at how this was implemented and what the words of the, how they're talking about it, they're normally talking about a grown adult that is not honoring their parents after they've left the house, right, and had their own family. Basically, they're slandering their parents. They're, just like being really horrible people to them. And then they bring them to the judge. They get the judgment. And then the kid says, I'm going to ignore that. So they are basically ignoring the laws of God, and they've been told about it, and probably told about it multiple times. So to say that this is like some way that God is saying, oh, you should kill your kids, is silly. And it's also ironic because many times the people that God judges, especially in the land of Israel, he's judging them for that reason. Like, right, they are killers of their own children and stuff like that, right? So God judges these people for the sin that Richard Dawkins is accusing God of. So I find that ironic. But yes, Luke, you got another question?
Yeah. How do you know? How do we know that this kid that you're saying here is more like a full-grown man? How do you prove that in the context of this?
So I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. So we have both also judges, or like what judges did in the past, right? We have basically like laws that, what judges have given out, and also I think it's the term is not like so. I have to remember, and I'm struggling to remember the term, but the term is not used, like the term in that sense, is the child is not used for babies or young people. It's used for like teenagers and adults, right? Like the actual Hebrew word, which I am blanking on. I'm sorry. I might have to come back to give you that one. So continue on. Let's see if this works. Hey, it worked the first time. I didn't have to punch it like 3 times. Then we have, is God a megalomaniac? That's another fun word to say. Again, this is just using intellectual words to kind of mask this idea that God is this evil person. Basically, a megalomaniac is someone who's obsessed with control, and which I find ironic because God, I said ironic like 3 or 4 times in this class. What is wrong with me today? So basically that God is obsessed with control and controlling things, which the reason I said I find it ironic is because if God was a megalomaniac, he could make every single person follow him perfectly, right? But we have basically, this whole thing, like, man, my brain is not working today. I am sorry. This is going to be the worst class I've ever done. Basically, I find this, term ironic of where they call it a megalomaniac. I just used ironic again. Man, this is a mess. I'm sorry, guys. Basically, this idea is basically, I find it where people who are megalomaniacs tend to not actually have control over the things that they have. But I find it that they throw it at God because they just want to have another big word to kind of throw at them, right? And then finally, kind of the last thing is that he talks about this all the time about how God is racist, which is the dumbest thing ever. And the thing I really find interesting about this is the people who are most likely to throw this accusation at God are in themselves actually kind of racist. In the sense of, they point to the fact that God has a chosen people, the Jews, right? He has a chosen race, and that they see that as negative, right? But you have to look at what that chosen race was supposed to be. They're supposed to be a light for the nations. They're supposed to be people that are supposed to draw everyone to God and to basically bring everyone to God in that way. And so that God picking people out is not this racist ideology. It's just kind of this idea that, God has people that he has selected to use for his purposes, right? Same thing with Christians, right? There are people that are, God predestines, that he selects to use for his purposes in the world, right? But the reason why I say I find that it's really interesting is that you have these people who, when they throw this accusation on God, are honestly sometimes racist in themselves, is because, I'm not saying this is all the time, but 9 times out of 10, when I've dealt with this with atheists, they honestly tend to really just hate the Jewish people, and that's why they throw it at God, which, gotta find that interesting. But we good? Any questions in relation to this? So let us move on to the next topic. The very fun thing of slavery. We're kind of starting into what I'm calling the kind of meat of this class. And so slavery is kind of an interesting thing. I find that there are a lot of people, and you see this a lot of kind of in my generation and younger, who say that the Bible having slavery is a moral, like basically a bad moral mark on the Bible, right? They think that the idea that there is slavery means that and it's also basically the system of slavery in the Bible is like, set up by God, right? And because of that, they think that it's this bad thing that God has done, and that we have basically that's a negative scar on it. But what I tend to find is that, and this is something I want you to guys all think about, is we have this idea of the transatlantic slave trade, right? This is kind of the thing that we think of, right? It's in the American zeitgeist of, we think of, the slavery, right? Because it's the closest form of slavery that we have, that we actually can visibly see. It's pretty prevalent. You go to, especially here, you can go to the Lincoln Museum and you can see, lots of depictions of slavery there, because that was something that Lincoln fought against, right? And you go, in America, you can find things where they talk about slavery, and it's this racist, kind of brutal, violent, inhumane thing, and that's what we think of when we hear slavery. But it's really not what the Old Testament slavery was about, right? So I would like you to kind of take that idea of slavery and just kind of put it to the side for now, right? And I would like to go through a few ideas. But first, I kind of want to also, this is kind of what people outside of Israel thought about slavery. So this is Aristotle. He's kind of seen as this great philosopher from Greece. But he says that from the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjugations, others to rule. So this is what the general population around Israel, from Egypt to Greece to even this goes all the way up to the Roman times. Like the Romans really believed in this, but it's really not what God had in mind when he was setting up this slavery for the Jewish people. So here's also a quote from Spurgeon. I like this. Moses did not institute slavery in any shape. The laws concerning it were made on purpose to repress it, to confine it within narrow boundaries, and ultimately put it to an end, right? So, as Spurgeon points out, slavery existed before the Jewish people had their own nation. Pretty obviously, because they were slaves in Egypt, right? So God takes that, right, because he knew it was going to be existent in Israel, and he puts boundaries on it. So I'd like to kind of go into that. So we're going to kind of take I'm hoping, a holistic view of the Bible when we look at these verses that talk about slavery. So if you could turn to Exodus 21, please. We're going to be in Exodus for a bit, and then we're going to do it by book. So we're starting with Exodus, and the next one is Leviticus, then Deuteronomy. So we're going to look at all the passages of slavery in each of these books, and we're going to talk about them. So Exodus 21, 2 through 6 is kind of the, I guess, like the starting of, the rule, like the big chunk of rules about slavery. So if anyone would be interested in reading that, that'd be awesome. Oh, Heather. Awesome. So Heather will read for us.
If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out for a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a freed man, then his master shall bring him to God. Then he shall bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently.
Okay. So we're going to look at this first part of this verse. Thank you for reading. So kind of this is the the first part of the book, or the first part of like talking about slavery in the Old Testament, we have these laws set out. So first off, you can see it's not like, what the transatlantic slave trade was, because that you were indentured for your entire life. There was like no freedom in that sense, where here they taught like, you have them for 6 years, and then on the 7th year, they're freed, right? The year, the year of Jubilee, right? That is the year that they would be set free, right? And so what it's talking about here is that there's 2 reasons why someone would sell themselves as a slave, right? And this is, they are selling themselves as this. The 2 reasons are they are poor and they can't provide for themselves, right? So they're like, this was kind of a way for people to, deal with poor people in their communities, right? They could sell themselves to a master, right? And then the master is responsible for, giving them food and water and all that stuff, lodging and all that. So they are responsible for that. And this person would work for them for 6 years, and then they're free. And everything they brought with them when they were freed, goes with them. So you read here, like, the wife that they have, if they comes with them, then when they leave, their wife goes with, also leaves with them. But we get to this portion here where it talks about if the master gives him a wife, right? So a lot of people tend to not understand this and think that, well, if he gives him a wife, then that means that the wife and the children are in that type of slavery where they're held for their lives. But, and we'll see this further on, that's not true. There's actually in the, we'll see it in a future verse, there's actually a distinction between male and female slaves, right? So the female slave, this right here is talking about the male slaves, if they're indentured for 6 years. But the female slaves, when they're sold like that, they're treated as daughters, right? And we'll go through that when we get there. But they're treated as daughters in the system. So if you bought a female slave, that was seen as kind of you're buying a daughter, and you would either marry them off to one of your sons, or you could also, I say it sees it as a daughter, but you could also buy a slave to marry yourself, right? And they're treated as full wives or full daughters, right, in the law. So what it's talking about here is when he gives him a wife to his slave, the reason she stays is because she is a daughter to him, right? And these children are seen as kind of like grandchildren. Hold on, Luke. And so why she doesn't leave with the slave is because she's still under what would be under in the law. She was under her father's protection, and she would still be even when her husband leaves, right? Make sense? Yes, Luke.
I think another good example of this, like actually happening in the Bible, would be like Jose buys Gomer back. From the slave market.
I'm not thinking of that off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
It just sounds like what you were describing here kind of sounds like.
Yeah. There's examples of this in the Old Testament where you have things like this. So then we'll talk about the second part, right? So this, but the servant declares, I love my master and I love my wife. Basically, he wants to stay with him. So basically, this is saying, I love my master, I want to stay with him. Oh, also, one point I forgot to point out. This thing here, if the master gives him a wife, right, this is consensual, right? This is not like if, if you were given a woman, you could technically say no if you didn't want to have a wife, right? So this is not something where the man had to say, here's a woman, I need more children, for whatever reason, right? They could say no to that. So this is a consensual thing. So that's why in here it says, I love my master and my wife, right? He wants to stay with his wife. And so he then is put into what would be, they wouldn't have the year of jubilation. But often when this does happen, and we've seen it in the things like that, this is kind of almost always treated as you're adding someone to your family, right? They wouldn't necessarily be equal with your children, right? But the Hebrew people, this is someone that's in your household. They are treated and they have the rights as family members, right? So while they wouldn't be like your biological children, that's how you were required to treat them in that type of law. Okay, good. Yes, Mr. Tompkins.
Yeah, isn't it a point to point out here is the transatlantic slavery as we know it in the Americas, that person was the property of their master.
Yes.
Where in the Old Testament, they don't consider it as property, as you're saying, but extension of the family.
Yes, they are seen as extensions of their family, and where, like, as you're saying, in the transatlantic slave trade, they are seen as property. Actually, we'll find this interesting when we get to there. I have when they talk about the rules. So when you buy a slave, right? I said this is a consensual agreement. When we further on, we're going to find something where if someone is kidnapped, right, and sold into slavery, the judge, like what if you find out that a person has been kidnapped, you are required, like the judge is required to execute that person, right? So if we take that type of ideology and apply it to the transatlantic slave trade, there'd be a lot of executions, right? Because that was nothing but pure kidnapping, right? So this is all consensual, where I agree to be sold into slavery because I either have a big debt or I can't provide for myself, right? So let's continue on with this. Move on to verses 7 through 11. Can I get someone else to read this? You should hopefully already be there. We're just moving on. A few extra verses.
I can read it.
Thank you.
If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she's not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money.
Okay. So here we see is what I was talking about, how female slaves were seen as daughters, right, or wives, right? So there's two reasons why you would sell, like it says if a man sells his daughter, because what it was is you had basically a woman was under the protection of her father until she married, right? And this is kind of more seen as, this is like, if you can kind of think of dowries, right? Where the man who wants to marry the wife will give her father a dowry for the woman, right? That's kind of what this is like here, right? So you have a daughter and she's sold as a slave, right? But she is seen either as a full wife, right? In the first part, where if she's married to the person who bought her, or as a full daughter if that person is given to one of her sons, right? In some translations, this son thing could be son or servant, right? But it's still the same idea of that this woman is like a full daughter to the person, right? And then finally, this kind of like last little part of where if he deprives her of these things, she goes free without any payment of money. What this is talking about is if this person is if her husband is bad, right? This is pointing out the part here of that her husband is abusing her, right? He's not giving the things she needs. She's depriving her of her, what is in the Bible, her rights. She's supposed to be fed and clothed and given shelter. If her husband is depriving her of that, she doesn't have to stay. She can just leave and not have to go through this legal system of trying to figure out can you leave, can you not, right? That's what it's saying there. If her husband's abusive, then she has the right to leave, right? Also find it interesting is like she's not allowed to be sold to foreigners, right? Because those are people that will, like the foreigners are not under the Mosaic law, right? They are, they have their own law system and they don't have the same protections as if you sold her to another Hebrew person, right? So she's protected in that sense because she still has the right to be redeemed by her family if that becomes necessary. So we see here of that they're basically trying to protect female slaves because a lot of times back in the ancient times and even up until even in the transatlantic slave trade this happened, people would buy women and use them as basically kind of like sex slaves, right? This is kind of putting a complete kibosh on that, saying like, no, if you have a female slave, she is either a full wife or a full daughter to you. You can't just like think of her as anything else, right? Good? Any questions? Yes, Luke?
All right. Basically, you back in the Exodus, verses 2 and 6. You can't exactly buy a female slave that's already married to someone.
No,
Okay.
you couldn't. No, because if you had a female could only be sold if she was not married, right? Because she was under her husband. Her husband could be sold, but that would be selling his work for the profit of his master, right? So if you see here, if he has a wife, he goes with her, like she goes with him, and then the master is responsible for both food and sheltering both of them, but she leaves with him. It's not this idea that you can't just sell. If a woman was married, she could not be sold, right?
And the second half of it's basically it's like if he wants to continue working for the master.
Yes, right. But that is more kind of grafting them into the family, basically. That's how it was seen back then. So, moving on, we're going a little bit further. We're going to verses 20 and 21. So if I could have someone read that, that'd be excellent.
If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod, and he does not die at his hands, he shall be punished. If, however, he survives a day or two, not vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property.
Okay. So this is where a lot of people, I think, make the mistake of not looking into the deeper context of the chapter and verse. So he's basically, what he's saying here is that if you have a slave and you beat them and they die, then you are punishable by the law, right? Often, this would actually mean execution, right? If you beat your slave to death, you would also often be executed, right? But then we get into this part here where it talks about if they don't die, then there is no punishment. And what people get kind of antsy about is this word here, their property, right? If you want to do an exact translation, it's for he is their money, right? And so if you look at this just by itself, this looks kind of a little bit weird, right? So you can beat your slave half to death, right? But you don't get punished. That's what a lot of people would argue, but that's not true. If we go further into verses, I believe it's 26. Yes, 26 and 27. Can I get someone to read 26 and 27? As we talk about the deeper context of this. Dad?
If someone strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free on account of the eye. And if he knocks out a tooth as male or female slave, then he shall let the slave go free on account of the tooth.
So, this is where you get the greater context, right? So if you beat your slave, they're free, right? So you've just lost all the money because they would pay these slaves, right? So if I had a debt and I needed to get it paid off, and I go to you and I'm like, hey, I can't pay this debt. I will go into bondage for you. I will work for you, and you pay off my debt. They pay off the debt, right? And then I'm working for them. But then if they beat you, right, all of a sudden you go free, right? There's no like nullification. It completely nullifies the contract. They still paid the, they still had to pay like my debts. They would still have to pay that, right? Or they would have already paid it. That happens at the beginning of the agreement, right? But at this point, so that's at this, like, you would go free. So that's what it's saying here. If we go back to this verse, there is no punishment, right? Because the punishment is they're losing out on the money, right? So if you beat your slave, all of a sudden, like, however many years left you would have gotten productive work out of this person, that's all gone now, right? So what it's doing here is it's really like it's preventing you from doing this. So what this is saying is if you kill your slave, your punishment is execution, right? If you beat them but they don't die, then the punishment is you lose out on the money you would have made through them, right? As if you just go to this verse, you can see that they are free if you beat them, right? Make sense? So if you think about this in the transatlantic slave trade, you hear these horrific stories of people being beaten. Well, if that happened, if you applied, the Old Testament principles, like, they would be freed at that point because that would be basically illegal to do, right? So that's what I'm trying to say when, we have this kind of American zeitgeist of the transatlantic slave trade, but if you applied the biblical principles, it does not, my brain is still not working. You couldn't have that, what happened here could not actually exist if you did apply biblical principles, right? So we're actually at time. So we'll kind of pick this up next week. But anyone have any questions or anything like that? If not, I think we're good. Cool. I will not be on the landfill next week, so hopefully I won't be so... Thank you all for coming.